He thought she was stealing. He was sure he would catch her red-handed. But when the director followed the cleaning lady after work, he saw something that changed his whole life. Subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching this video. Morning sunlight spilled across the polished floor of the top-level office, casting long reflections over the glass partitions and the rows of white desks that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and ambition. William Hunter stood by the window, a coffee cup in hand, looking out over the sprawling city that glittered with restless traffic and the promise of profit. It was the hour when executives arrived early to prove themselves, clutching laptops and half-finished cappuccinos, nodding sharply to receptionists as they moved with the precise choreography of people who measured their worth by calendars and quarterly reports. At 45, William was a man who had learned to contain the tremors of anxiety behind the press of his tailored suit and the steel in his pale blue eyes. The path that led him here had been built brick by careful brick. An education clawed from scholarships, nights spent studying when his mother slept exhausted on the couch, promotions earned through aggressive excellence, and the willingness to put the company before everything else. Now, as CEO of Nexus Core Systems, he was the gatekeeper of billions in investment and the architect of a future that would be displayed on the international stage in less than 3 weeks. The next product launch was everything, he reminded himself as he sipped the too-hot coffee, feeling it scald his tongue. Investors would be watching, competitors circling like hawks, and the smallest error could unravel years of planning. He turned from the view, striding back to his desk where a dozen messages blinked insistently on the edge of the screen. There were contracts waiting for his signature, reports needing approval, and an internal audit he had requested just days ago, a security sweep to ensure everything was aligned before the launch. The company, Nexus, was sleek and restless, always hungry for the next advancement in educational technologies. Their AI-assisted learning tablets were meant to revolutionize classrooms with adaptive software that could analyze and respond to each student's learning pace, promising a future where every child could have a personal tutor in their hands. William believed in this vision, even if he sometimes doubted the ethics of the shortcuts his team suggested to keep ahead of competitors. It was during these audits that the first mention of her appeared. A note from security, brief and almost dismissive. The night cleaning staff had been observed lingering in restricted zones. It was the sort of line William usually skimmed over, trusting his department heads to handle such trivial matters. But the word lingering caught his eye that morning, a thread pulling at the weave of his concentration. He opened the footage attached, watching on fast-forward as a slim figure in a gray uniform moved through the empty corridors, a cart pushed steadily ahead. She paused near one of the engineering labs, glancing around before slipping inside. William leaned closer, narrowing his eyes. The camera's angle showed her silhouette illuminated by the glow of a monitor, her hands hovering above the table where an incomplete prototype lay among scattered tools. It was easy to dismiss the night cleaning staff, to forget their presence entirely, as long as the offices remained clean and the trash bins were emptied. But William found himself unable to move past the image of her standing quietly in the blue glow of the engineering lab and later again near the server room, slipping something into her bag before wheeling the cart away. It was an old suspicion that rose in him, a cold reminder of how easily trust could become a vulnerability. The industry was vicious. Intellectual property stolen and sold by insiders with debts or desperation, sometimes even for reasons less understandable than money. William's eyes followed her across the grainy footage as she moved to the elevators, head down, the cart neatly arranged with cleaning supplies. It was her posture, the way she carried herself with a tired precision that struck him. He pulled up her file, minimal as it was. Name, age, single mother, no higher education, employed through a contracted cleaning service. Her address was in a neighborhood he only knew by the color-coded crime reports the city sent out each quarter. It made sense, he told himself, that someone in her position might see an opportunity for quick money. The thought that his suspicion might have another layer, an uglier one, crossed his mind only fleetingly, a discomfort he pushed aside as practicality. It wasn't personal, he reminded himself, just business. The launch was too important, the risks too high, to ignore potential threats, even if they wore the uniform of a night cleaner and smiled politely in the rare instances their paths crossed. Still, the small, uneasy part of him wondered if his perception of her was colored by the darkness of her skin against the sterile white of the offices she cleaned, by the tiredness in her eyes that he interpreted as evasiveness, by the weight of assumptions he had learned to carry without question. He decided not to alert security further, choosing instead to watch. It was, he reasoned, the most direct path to the truth without creating unnecessary rumors that might unsettle the staff during these critical weeks. And so, William adjusted his schedule to remain late, feigning workload while he moved quietly from meeting to meeting, his eyes on the clock as the hour of her shift approached. He noticed details he had previously overlooked in the daily rhythm of Nexus, how the cleaning staff entered with the hush of shadows, how they wiped down desks with careful circular motions, how they paused to empty bins without interrupting the intense conversations of the engineers who stayed late. When she arrived, she did so with the soft tread of someone accustomed to moving unnoticed, her uniform pressed, hair tied back in a simple braid, a pair of worn sneakers on her feet instead of the standard-issue boots. He watched as she began her routine, her cart parked by the wall while she sprayed down glass walls and wiped away fingerprints, her eyes flickering to the screens left on by developers who had stepped out for coffee or a smoke. There was no sign of wrongdoing, nothing more than the mechanical repetition of cleaning, yet William felt a growing tension as he waited for the moment she would slip again, like in the footage. The moment came when she paused near one of the developer's desks, her gaze catching on the lines of code scrolling across the monitor. She tilted her head slightly, eyes narrowing in a way that suggested understanding rather than confusion, and William felt the hairs on his neck rise. She moved on quickly, but not before pulling a phone from her pocket and, it seemed to him, snapping a quick photo before sliding it back, her face calm, unreadable. That was enough. He followed her movements throughout the evening, seeing the same pattern repeat. The small, careful glances, the subtle shifts in her posture when she passed the labs where prototypes lay charging, the brief pauses near screens filled with confidential data. By the time she wheeled her cart back to the service elevator and disappeared down to the lower levels, William had made his decision. He would follow her. It was nearly midnight when she left the building, slipping into the cold night with a canvas bag slung over her shoulder, her breath visible in the air. William followed in his car, headlights dimmed as he kept a cautious distance, his mind rehearsing the possible outcomes. He imagined her meeting with a buyer, exchanging the stolen devices for cash in a dimly lit parking lot, or delivering confidential photos to a competitor's agent in a shabby cafe. His mind constructed these images with the precision of someone accustomed to anticipating the worst. As they moved away from the bright streets near Nexus and into the older districts of the city, the roads narrowed, the sidewalks cracked and cluttered with trash bins and leaning fences. Neon lights of liquor stores flickered above shuttered laundromats and fast food outlets, and figures moved in doorways, watching without seeing. Her pace did not quicken, her shoulders squared against the cold, her breath steady. She turned down a side street lined with small sagging houses and parked cars with missing hubcaps. She paused outside a squat building with flaking paint and a hand-painted sign that read, West Side Family and Education Center. William pulled over across the street, his engine idling as he watched her disappear inside. For several minutes, he did nothing, just watched the dim light spilling out onto the cracked pavement, hearing the distant wail of a siren somewhere deeper in the city. Then, almost against his better judgment, he stepped out of the car, crossing the street toward the building, the air biting at his skin as he drew closer to the windows. Inside, he saw children, some sitting cross-legged on the floor, others clustered around tables littered with battered laptops and tangled chargers. She moved among them, her hands deft as she plugged in cords, adjusted screens, and knelt to speak to the youngest ones, her face lit by a gentle smile that William had never seen in the sterile halls of Nexus. She handed out small devices, the same ones he had seen her place in her bag, and the children's faces glowed with a mixture of disbelief and excitement as they clutched them to their chests. William pressed closer to the window, squinting as he tried to understand what he was seeing. She stood before a whiteboard, a marker in her hand, drawing out diagrams that looked suspiciously like code structures and simple algorithms, speaking with quiet authority as the children leaned in to watch. There was a rhythm to her teaching, a calm and deliberate energy that filled the small, worn room with an air of focused hope. It struck him then, with the force of a revelation, that he was not witnessing a crime, but something else entirely, something he could not yet fully name. The stolen devices were not stolen, the photos were not espionage. She was building something here in the shadows of the city, in a place where opportunity rarely came, and the children, with their eager eyes and small determined hands, were learning to see a future that extended beyond the walls of their neighborhood. For a long moment, William stood there, the cold forgotten, as the world inside the building unfolded before him like a story he had never learned to read. Then, as the children began to pack up, hugging their devices and chattering about the next lesson, he turned away, retreating to his car with a mind full of questions he was not ready to answer. Driving back through the quiet streets, the city lights reflecting off the windshield like silent accusations, William realized that the launch, the investors, the product that he had believed to be the most important part of his world, felt suddenly small against what he had witnessed. The suspicion that had driven him, the comfortable certainty that he was protecting his company from a threat, had dissolved, leaving in its place the unsettling knowledge that he had been blind to something far more valuable than any product Nexus could build. As he parked in his reserved spot beneath the Nexus tower, the weight of what he had seen pressed against his chest. He sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, before finally letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Tomorrow, he decided, he would need to understand who she really was. The morning arrived with an uncharacteristic heaviness for William, the winter sun pale behind the gray sweep of the clouds as he stood again at the window of his office, coffee cooling in his hand while his eyes followed the lines of traffic crawling below. The previous night remained vivid, scenes replaying with the clarity of a confession he had witnessed but could not fully interpret. The children's faces lifted toward her with fragile hope, the glow of old screens lighting up their small hands, the quiet authority in her voice as she spoke about code and futures and possibilities that did not fit inside the boardrooms of Nexus. It had left him restless, pacing the carpeted floor of his apartment, the city's hush around him too loud for sleep. At the office, the familiar rhythms were unchanged. Emails requesting sign-offs on supply contracts, reminders from the communications team about upcoming media briefings, a polite but insistent nudge from the CFO about refining budget allocations for the launch event. William moved through them with mechanical efficiency, answering in curt, clear sentences, his mind only half present as he tried to reconcile the image of the woman he had suspected with the reality of who she might be. He found himself staring at her employee file again between meetings, at the sterile, incomplete lines of data that summarized her existence within the company. Single mother, employee of the cleaning contractor Nexus used, present every shift without exception, noted for punctuality and thoroughness. There was no mention of the second life she led beyond these walls, of the center where she bent over laptops and children alike, of the way she seemed to create space for hope in a building that looked ready to collapse under the weight of its age and neglect. William closed the file, the cursor blinking accusingly at the edge of the screen, before he minimized it and pressed his fingertips to his eyes, trying to will away the tension that had lodged in the space between his shoulders. The day passed in meetings and polite deceptions, the language of business wrapping around him like a cloak he had worn for so long that he barely felt its weight. Yet, beneath each conversation lay a thread of distraction, tugging at him whenever he saw a screen displaying lines of code or past an engineer's desk where a prototype tablet lay charging. Each small detail reminded him of the girl's steady gaze as she taught the children to type, of the way she checked the cords and chargers, ensuring everything was in working order before she let them take the devices home. It was an echo, quiet but persistent, that followed him into the evening. When the office finally began to empty, with engineers heading out for drinks and younger executives taking calls as they slipped into elevators, William found himself sitting in the dark, the glow of the city seeping through the windows, watching the minute hand of the clock move toward the hour when the cleaning staff would arrive. He had told himself that he would leave it alone, that he had seen enough, but as the elevator doors opened and she stepped out, pushing her cart, his resolve dissolved. He observed as she began her routine, the same careful process of wiping glass walls and collecting stray coffee cups, her movements efficient, precise, as if each task was a ritual she honored with quiet respect. She moved like someone accustomed to being invisible, yet there was no defeat in the way she carried herself, no bitterness in the way she bent to empty bins or straightened chairs. It was that dignity that struck him hardest, for it was a quality he had seen often in boardrooms and negotiations, yet rarely recognized in those whose labor underpinned the company's daily operations. William waited, heart ticking with a slow, deliberate beat, as she made her way toward the engineering wing. She paused, as she had the previous night, near a workstation where a tablet prototype lay open, the screen still alive with the developer's unfinished script. Her eyes flickered across the code, her brow furrowing just slightly, the ghost of understanding moving across her face before she adjusted the tablet's position to prevent its vents from blocking, a small gesture that seemed at once intimate and technical. He caught the moment when she pulled out her phone, tilting it to take a photograph, and he stepped forward from the shadow, his voice stopping her before she could move away. But in that breath between his movement and his words, he saw the fear flash in her eyes, the tightening of her shoulders, the way her fingers closed around the phone, not to hide it, but to protect it, to protect herself. The words that came to his lips died, replaced by a silence that stretched between them as the hum of the building's systems whispered around them. She turned away, moving quickly now, pushing the cart ahead of her with renewed urgency, her steps faster, sharper, as if she had remembered that she was trespassing in a world that would not welcome her curiosity. William did not call out again. Instead, he followed from a distance, maintaining the space between them as she completed her rounds, moving from floor to floor, the pattern unchanged, yet now threaded with the tension of his presence behind her. When she finally returned the cart to the service area and left through the staff entrance, William was already in his car, engine idling, watching as she stepped into the cold, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders as she began the walk toward the bus stop. He followed, headlights off, keeping 3 cars' lengths behind her as she made her way through the streets, turning corners with the cautious familiarity of someone who knew these roads in the dark. Tonight, she did not take the bus. She continued walking, past shuttered shops and quiet intersections, the city around her slowly emptying of traffic as the hour grew late. She moved steadily, the rhythm of her steps unchanging, even as she crossed into a neighborhood where streetlights flickered and the sidewalks were littered with debris. William recognized the landmarks now, the same cracked pavement, the same graffiti-tagged fences, the same squat building with the peeling sign. She entered the West Side Family and Education Center, and William parked once more across the street, the hum of his car the only sound as he watched the door close behind her. He did not get out immediately. Instead, he sat, hands on the wheel, remembering the faces of the children, the glow of the screens, the look of pride on her face as she watched them work. The image clashed with the suspicion that had driven him here, a suspicion that now felt hollow, as if it belonged to a man he no longer wished to be. After several minutes, he stepped out, crossing the street quietly, moving toward the window where he had stood the previous night. Inside, the scene was the same, yet different. The children were there, some of the same faces, joined by others, a few parents sitting in the back, watching as she moved among the tables, checking the devices, guiding small hands across keyboards, her voice a calm, steady presence in the room. She wrote on the whiteboard diagrams of simple coding exercises, loops and logic gates, and the children followed with bright, focused eyes, their notebooks filled with careful notes, their fingers moving hesitantly but determinedly across the keyboards. Tonight, William stayed longer, his breath clouding the glass as he watched her pause to help a young boy with a tattered backpack, guiding his fingers to the correct keys, her patience endless, her smile encouraging. She moved on to a group of teenagers working on a shared project, helping them debug a small game they had built, explaining the error messages with a clarity that belied the assumption that she was merely a cleaner. Her daughter was there too, sitting quietly at a table, working on a lesson while keeping an eye on the younger children, a small caretaker in training, mirroring her mother's calm. As the evening wore on, William felt the cold seep through his coat, but he did not move, unable to look away from the quiet miracle unfolding inside the room. When the session ended, the children packed up, some lingering to thank her, others waving shyly as they left with parents or older siblings. She remained behind, cleaning the tables, wiping down the screens, checking that the chargers were properly stored. It was nearly midnight when she finally stepped out, locking the door behind her, the weight of exhaustion visible in the slump of her shoulders, yet there was still a lightness in the way she paused to look back at the building before turning to walk away. William followed her again, this time not out of suspicion, but out of something closer to understanding, though he would not yet admit it to himself. He watched as she made her way home, climbing the narrow steps to a small apartment above a closed shop, pausing to adjust the blanket around her sleeping daughter before unlocking the door and disappearing inside. He remained there, parked across the streetlights casting long shadows on the cracked pavement, the city around him quiet as he sat with the weight of what he had seen. The questions that had driven him here were no longer the questions he needed answered. He no longer wondered if she was stealing from him, but instead found himself asking what it meant that she, with so little, was given so much, while he, with everything, had given so little to those who needed it most. When he returned to his apartment that night, the city's lights reflecting off the glass walls, William found himself standing by the window, looking out over the streets where she walked, where she worked, where she taught. He thought of the children, of their hands moving across keyboards, of their eyes bright with the hope of a future they were learning to claim. And he thought of her, moving through the shadows of a world that too often overlooked her, building something real with the smallest of tools, refusing to give in to the weight of the world's indifference. As the dawn began to break, washing the city in pale gold, William made a decision. Tomorrow he would learn her name properly. Tomorrow he would begin to understand the truth he had been blind to for far too long. The morning came softly, the sky washed in muted blue as William stood once again by his window, coffee in hand, his reflection faint in the glass. The city was beginning to stir below, lights flickering off in high-rise apartments as early commuters filled the streets, taxis weaving between buses, the hum of movement a low, constant sound. It should have been like any other morning, another day folded into the careful layers of his structured life, but it was not. The images from the night before stayed with him, a quiet insistence behind every thought, behind every task he tried to complete. The glow of those children's faces, the calm authority in her voice, the way she moved between them with quiet confidence as she taught them about loops and logic. All of it clung to him, weaving itself into the silence of his apartment, into the rhythm of his breath. He dressed methodically, choosing a dark suit, crisp white shirt, the tie a precise knot, the ritual calming even as the weight of the questions pressed against him. His mind wandered to her, to the way she had bent down to help a small boy find the right keys on a worn keyboard, the way her eyes softened when she looked at the children, each one treated with respect and focus, as if nothing else in the world mattered in that moment but their understanding. It was not pity in her gaze, but expectation, belief that they could learn, that they could build, that they could grow. It was an expression he had not seen often in the world he occupied, where worth was measured in numbers and charts, where failures were noted in red ink on reports, where the future was something bought and sold with strategic partnerships and well-timed launches. The drive to the office felt longer that morning, the streets blurred past him, lights and colors merging as he replayed the moments from the previous night. He parked in his usual spot, greeting the security guard with a nod, stepping into the lobby where the polished floors reflected the high ceilings, the scent of fresh coffee mixing with the quiet buzz of conversation. He moved through the halls with practiced ease, but his mind was elsewhere. His thoughts pulling him back to the small room with the peeling paint, the mismatched chairs, the glow of laptops illuminating eager faces. At his desk, he pulled up her file again, the sparse details more glaring now in their inadequacy. Her name, which he had read but never spoken aloud, now seemed almost too small for the image he carried of her. Naomi Carter, age 32, single mother, Employed through Clanco Services, a contractor Nexus had used for years without much thought beyond cost and schedule. Her address was listed, a street name he now recognized, the building he had parked across from, the narrow stairway he had seen her climb, her daughter's small form wrapped in a blanket as they disappeared inside. No record of higher education, no additional employment noted, no disciplinary actions. Only a note that she was punctual, thorough, rarely missed a shift. He closed the file, his reflection staring back at him from the dark screen before he turned to the window, watching the clouds move slowly across the sky. A knock on his door brought him back, his assistant stepping in with a tablet, reminders of the meetings scheduled for the day, the briefings he needed to prepare for, the list of investors expecting updates on the launch progress. He nodded, taking the tablet, scrolling through the bullet points, but each word felt disconnected, as if it belonged to another world entirely, a world that now felt shallow compared to the quiet determination he had seen the night before. The hours moved with the slow precision of routine, meetings held in glass-walled rooms, voices calm and firm as plans were discussed, metrics reviewed, projections adjusted. William contributed where needed, his words clear, his posture confident, but his mind was split, one part attending to the demands of leadership, the other returning again and again to Naomi Carter, to the children, to the quiet room where hope was nurtured with outdated laptops and worn textbooks. He thought of the way she had moved between them, answering questions, offering encouragement, expecting effort, and rewarding it with her attention, her praise given sparingly but sincerely. By late afternoon, as the office settled into a brief lull, he found himself walking the halls, the polished floors reflecting the overhead lights, the glass walls offering glimpses of engineers bent over prototypes, designers adjusting presentations for the upcoming launch. He paused near the engineering wing, watching as a team debated over a tablet's functionality, the conversation technical, precise, but edged with the tension that had been building as the launch approached. One of the engineers left the device on a table, walking away to take a call, the screen still glowing with lines of code. William watched, and in that moment he saw Naomi's reflection in his mind, the way she had adjusted a similar device to prevent it from overheating, the way her eyes had flickered over the code not with confusion, but with recognition. It was a small, precise movement, one that had meant nothing to him before, but now stood out as an echo of something deeper, a knowledge he had not attributed to her until now. He moved on, the image following him, the question forming more clearly now: who was she, really, beyond the limits of the file, beyond the assumptions he had made? That evening, as the office lights dimmed and the staff began to leave, William returned to his desk, opening his laptop to search for answers. He began with public records, tracing her history with the patience of someone used to piecing together incomplete stories. Her name appeared in small notes from local schools, community events, newsletters that mentioned her volunteering at after-school programs, helping with computer literacy classes, her presence consistent but quiet, never seeking recognition. There was a photo, small and grainy, of her standing with a group of children, holding a certificate given for volunteer service, her smile tired but genuine. Further back, he found a record of her employment at a public high school, listed as an assistant in the computer lab, then as an instructor for a basic coding course offered in the evenings. The school had closed 5 years ago, funding pulled, the building now abandoned, its windows boarded up. There was a brief mention in a local article about the closure, a quote from Naomi about the importance of keeping technology education available for all children, her words firm but overshadowed by the reality of the budget cuts that had ended the program. William sat back, the office silent around him, the screen's glow illuminating the questions that now demanded answers. She had been a teacher, a mentor, before circumstances had pushed her into the anonymity of cleaning shifts, before necessity had forced her to take the work that was available, trading the satisfaction of teaching for the security of a paycheck, however meager. Yet, even within that constraint, she had found a way to continue, to gather what resources she could, to rebuild in the evenings what had been taken from her during the day. The realization settled over him, heavy yet clarifying, the pieces aligning in a pattern he could no longer ignore. Naomi Carter was not stealing from Nexus. She was salvaging what was discarded, what was considered obsolete by a company forever chasing the next advancement, and transforming it into opportunity for those who had been left behind. She was not an intruder, but a quiet revolutionary, using the fragments of the future Nexus created to build hope in the present for children who would otherwise never touch the technology that was shaping the world around them. As the clock moved past midnight, William closed his laptop, the decision forming quietly within him. Tomorrow, he would speak to her. Tomorrow, he would step beyond the glass walls of his office and the safety of assumptions, and he would ask her to tell him her story in her own words. He would ask not as a CEO suspicious of theft, but as a man seeking to understand the truth that lived in the spaces outside the conference rooms, in the classrooms that appeared only after the office lights dimmed. He left the office, the quiet halls echoing softly with his footsteps, the security guard nodding as he passed, the city outside dark but alive, lights flickering in windows, cars moving slowly through the streets. As he drove home, he thought of the children, of the way they had looked at Naomi, their trust in her, their eagerness to learn despite the limitations around them. He thought of the center, small and fragile, yet filled with a purpose that Nexus itself claimed to support, but rarely embodied so completely. Parking outside his building, William sat in the car for a moment, the engine ticking softly as it cooled, the weight of the day settling around him. The decisions he would make in the coming days would define more than the success of a product launch. They would define the kind of leader he was, the kind of man he was willing to become. The questions had changed, and so too would his answers. Tomorrow he would return to the West Side Family and Education Center, not to watch from the shadows, but to step inside, to listen, to learn. Tomorrow he would begin to discover the world Naomi Carter had built, a world that had been growing quietly alongside his own, a world that might yet teach him the meaning of value beyond the numbers on a screen. And, for the first time in many weeks, as he turned off the car and stepped into the quiet of his apartment, William felt the possibility that the future might hold more than he had dared to imagine, that there was room in the precision of his carefully managed world for something as unpredictable, as essential as hope. Morning light spilled into William's apartment through the tall windows, the soft gold warmth pressing against the cold steel gray of the city's dawn. He had been awake for hours, his mind tracing the steps that had led him here, each thought looping back to the night before, to Naomi Carter's quiet determination and the children's eager, focused faces in the glow of outdated screens. It was as if his world, carefully layered with clean lines and profit margins, had been cracked open by the simple reality of a woman who refused to let what was left behind be wasted, who refused to let forgotten children remain forgotten, even when the world insisted on looking past them. He dressed with intention, choosing a dark suit but leaving the tie draped over the back of a chair, rolling his sleeves as he checked the morning's emails with precise focus. The messages were the same as they always were. Investors requesting projections, engineers sending status updates on prototype testing, the PR team reminding him about the statements prepared for the upcoming launch press conference. Each line of text, each neatly formatted attachment, felt like a ghost, a hollow echo of the real work happening quietly in the shadows of the city where Naomi was teaching coding to children who should have had better, who should not have needed to learn on battered laptops held together by tape and hope. William arrived at the office before the others, the halls quiet, the glass walls reflecting him back to himself as he walked toward his office. He settled behind his desk, the view of the city sprawling before him, the river cutting a line of silver through the morning mist. The hum of the building's systems was the only sound as he opened Naomi's file once more, the sparse lines of her employment record unable to capture the complexity he had seen in her over these past days. Her name, her address, the emergency contact listed as her neighbor in the same building, no higher education recorded, no incidents noted, no accolades listed, only that she arrived on time, did her job, and left each day with quiet efficiency. It was not enough. It was never enough, and now he knew it. He closed the file and opened his laptop, searching for public records, for newspaper archives, for any mention of Naomi Carter that might piece together the story she had never told, the story that the world had ignored. It was a slow process, the minutes ticking by as he sifted through old local articles, school newsletters, community bulletins. A picture began to emerge, blurry at first, but sharpening with each line he read. Naomi Carter had once been a teacher, an assistant in the computer lab of a public high school before becoming an instructor in the evenings, running coding workshops for teenagers in the neighborhood, teaching them the basics of programming, of logic, of how to navigate a world increasingly shaped by technology. There were quotes attributed to her in articles about community programs, about the need for technological education to be accessible, about the importance of giving children the tools to shape their futures rather than simply surviving in the present. Her words were steady, measured, her face in the few photographs he found always calm, her smile reserved but real. The high school where she worked had closed 5 years ago, shuttered due to budget cuts and the shifting priorities of a city eager to redevelop low-income neighborhoods into profitable new ventures. The children who had once filled the computer lab, who had sat at the aging desktops under Naomi's watchful eye, had been scattered, left to find their way without guidance, without access. There was a moment, a point in time, when Naomi had tried to fight the closure, organizing meetings with parents, speaking at city council hearings, her voice recorded in meeting minutes he found buried in public archives, stating simply that the loss of the program would leave children with fewer opportunities, would push them further into cycles of poverty they had done nothing to deserve. Her protests had been noted, then ignored, as the funding was reallocated and the building sold to developers who left it abandoned, the windows boarded, the playground behind it overgrown with weeds. William sat back, the weight of her history pressing into him, a story of persistence in the face of indifference, a quiet fight carried out without recognition, without reward. The pieces clicked together with a clarity that left him momentarily breathless. Naomi Carter had not stopped when the school closed. She had simply moved her classroom to wherever it could fit, to a crumbling community center, to borrowed spaces, to wherever she could find a place for the children who still came, who still needed to learn, who still wanted a chance to see beyond the narrow boundaries their circumstances placed around them. His phone buzzed with a reminder about the morning's meeting with the engineering team, the launch of the new educational tablets now only days away. William glanced at the time, closing the tabs on his browser, his reflection in the darkened screen looking back at him with an unfamiliar steadiness. He stood, moving through the halls toward the conference room, his steps measured, his mind no longer clouded by the excuses he had used to avoid seeing the truth. The meeting was as expected, the engineers presenting updates on testing, minor issues resolved, the production timeline holding steady. William listened, asked questions, took notes, but a part of him remained with Naomi, with the image of her guiding small hands across a keyboard, her eyes lifting with quiet pride as a child solved a problem on their own. When the meeting ended, he dismissed the engineers with a nod, remaining behind as they filed out, their voices fading down the hall. Alone, he pulled out his phone, searching for the number of the West Side Family and Education Center, letting the ring echo in the quiet room until a voice answered, warm but tired, asking how they could help. He introduced himself, his voice steady, requesting to speak with Naomi Carter if she was available. There was a pause, a moment of silence that stretched before the woman on the line asked him to hold, the muffled sounds of children and conversation filling the space as he waited. When Naomi's voice came on the line, it was cautious, careful, the tone of someone used to guarding herself against disappointment. William introduced himself again, this time not as CEO of Nexus, but simply as someone who had seen her work and wanted to understand more, someone who had questions that only she could answer. There was another pause, longer this time before she agreed to meet, her voice softening as she suggested a time that evening after her class at the center. The day moved slowly, each hour stretching as William attended to his duties, his mind occupied with the coming conversation, the questions he would ask, the explanations he would offer, the apologies he needed to make, even if he did not yet know how. When evening came, he left the office without his usual ceremony, the lights of the city bright against the darkening sky as he drove toward the part of town he had only recently begun to see with clear eyes. The center was as he remembered, the sign above the door still faded, the paint still peeling, but inside the lights were warm, the voices of children mixing with the low hum of old computers, the air filled with the scent of old wood and hope. Naomi was there, her presence calm, her daughter sitting at a table nearby, helping another child with a math problem on a scrap of paper. Naomi looked up as he entered, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of curiosity and wariness, her posture straight, her hands folded in front of her. They spoke quietly, moving to a corner of the room as the children continued their work, the conversation halting at first, William explaining what he had seen, what he had assumed, the suspicions he had carried, the reasons he had followed her. Naomi listened, her face unreadable, her eyes flickering with a shadow of anger that quickly settled into resignation. She explained her work, her reasons, her refusal to give up on the children who still came to her, her belief that technology should not be a privilege reserved for those who could afford it, but a tool for all who were willing to learn. She spoke of the donations she salvaged, the devices Nexus discarded as outdated, the hours she spent repairing them, installing software, preparing them for the children who needed them. She described the nights spent cleaning offices so she could afford the rent, the mornings spent teaching, the hours in between spent searching for grants, for donations, for any help she could find to keep the program alive. William listened, each word weaving into him, the image of the world he had built cracking further with each piece of her truth. They spoke until the children began to leave, their parents arriving to collect them, the room slowly emptying until only Naomi, her daughter, and William remained. The conversation shifted then, softening as Naomi spoke of her dreams for the center, her hopes for the children, her belief that they could shape the future if only they were given the chance. William found himself speaking of his own childhood, of the opportunities he had fought for, of the way he had believed in technology as a force for good, even as he had lost sight of what that meant in the pursuit of profit. As the night grew deeper, they stood in the quiet of the empty room, the glow of the street lights filtering through the windows, the sounds of the city muffled by the walls around them. Naomi looked at him then, her eyes steady, her posture calm, and William saw not the cleaner he had once suspected, but the teacher, the leader, the quiet force of change she truly was. He realized in that moment that the future he had been building at Nexus was incomplete, that the technology they created meant nothing if it did not reach those who needed it most, if it did not serve as a bridge rather than a barrier. When he left the center that night, the streets were empty, the city quiet, the weight of the conversation sitting in him not as a burden, but as a promise. The path forward was not yet clear, but it was there. A line drawn in the glow of old screens and the hope in children's eyes. A reminder that the measure of success was not in the numbers on a quarterly report, but in the lives touched, in the opportunities created, in the futures shaped by the choices made in moments like this. And for the first time in a long while, as he drove home under the quiet sky, William felt that he was on the verge of doing something that truly mattered. The morning after leaving the West Side Family and Education Center, William awoke before dawn, the city still draped in darkness as the first light crept across the horizon. He lay in bed for a moment, the silence of his apartment pressing around him, the quiet broken only by the steady hum of the heating system and the faint groan of pipes expanding with the early warmth. His mind was awake, fully alert, the images from the night before vivid in his memory. Naomi's calm voice, the steady conviction in her words as she spoke of the children, of opportunity, of futures worth fighting for even when the world seemed determined to ignore them. There was something unshakable in her, a quiet certainty that had begun to unsettle the rigid framework of his life. He rose, showered, dressed without his usual deliberation, choosing a dark blue suit and a tie he only realized he had selected after it was already knotted around his neck. As he stepped out of his apartment, the cold morning air met him with sharp clarity, a reminder of the day ahead, of the meeting scheduled, the calls with investors, the looming product launch that had dominated every conversation within Nexus for weeks. The hum of the city waking filled the streets, lights blinking on in office windows, taxis weaving through early traffic, the rhythm of a place driven by ambition, and the relentless pursuit of what came next. Arriving at the Nexus building, William moved through the glass doors with a purposeful stride, nodding to the security guard at the entrance, the familiar scent of coffee and the faint tang of cleaning supplies greeting him as he entered the lobby. The elevators were quiet this early, the lights overhead reflecting off the polished walls as he rode up to his floor, stepping out into the quiet of the executive wing, where the day's chaos had yet to begin. He unlocked his office, the soft click of the door echoing in the empty hallway, and set his briefcase down, walking to the window to look out over the city below. The river was a dark ribbon cutting through the landscape, the lights of the bridges casting long reflections on the water, the distant sound of horns and engines rising as the city came fully to life. William took a breath, feeling the weight of what was coming, the sense that change was not only possible but necessary, that the conversation with Naomi had shifted something fundamental within him, something he could not ignore even if he tried. His phone buzzed, pulling him back into the rhythm of the day. A message from his assistant reminding him of the morning's briefing with the engineering team. The product launch was 3 days away, and every detail mattered. The educational tablets Nexus had spent years developing were the culmination of countless hours of work, of investment, of promises made to shareholders and partners about the future of learning technology. It was a future William had believed in, still believed in, but now with the knowledge that belief was not enough if it did not translate into real, tangible change for those who needed it most. He moved through the morning with focused precision, meeting with department heads, reviewing last-minute updates, approving marketing materials, each task completed with the calm assurance of someone who had spent years mastering the art of corporate navigation. Yet, beneath the calm, a thread of tension pulled at him, a sense that something fragile and important was at stake, something beyond the metrics and projections laid out in the charts presented during each meeting. As the afternoon approached, a message came through from the engineering floor requesting an urgent meeting. William made his way down, the hum of the company's operations louder here, voices layered over the low thrum of machines and the occasional sharp ring of a phone. The lead engineer, a man named Patel with tired eyes and a quick mind, met him with a strained expression, gesturing him into a conference room where several members of the development team were already gathered. The atmosphere in the room was different today, the air tight with unease, the usual chatter replaced by a heavy silence as William took his seat, folding his hands on the table, his eyes moving over the faces around him. Patel cleared his throat, a laptop open before him, the screen displaying lines of code interspersed with error messages highlighted in harsh red. William listened as the issue was explained, the technical terms weaving into a clear reality. A flaw had been discovered in the integration layer of the tablet's software, a flaw that, under high-usage conditions, caused the system to freeze, sometimes resulting in data loss, sometimes in a complete shutdown of the device. The flaw was not immediately apparent in earlier tests, only surfacing during the final stress testing designed to simulate heavy classroom use. As the details unfolded, William felt the weight of the room press into him, the knowledge that this flaw, if not resolved, would delay the launch, would trigger penalties and contracts, would lead to cascading effects that could shake investor confidence and potentially cost the company millions. The engineers spoke over one another, offering theories, possible patches, temporary workarounds, each suggestion carrying with it new risks, new delays. William held up a hand, the voices falling silent, the room waiting as he took a breath, his mind working through the possibilities. It was in this silence that he saw the reflection of Naomi in his mind, her quiet certainty, the steady way she approached problems, not with panic but with clarity, with a focus on what mattered most. He looked around the room, seeing the strain in the faces of his team, the fear behind their urgency, the unspoken worry of what failure would mean. "We will fix this," he said, his voice calm, steady, the certainty in it real, even as he felt the pulse of urgency under his skin. The engineers nodded, some with relief, some with continued worry, and the meeting moved into strategy, into lists of potential solutions, of who would take on which tasks, of how they would approach the problem without losing the timeline completely. As the engineers filed out, returning to their workstations, the hum of focused effort returning to the floor, William remained in the conference room, the glow of the laptop screen before him, the error messages still blinking, a reminder of the fragility of even the most carefully constructed plans. He tapped his fingers against the table, his mind turning over the problem, remembering the way Naomi had adjusted the tablet on the desk, the way her eyes had flickered over the code with recognition, not confusion. An idea formed, a quiet thought that grew louder the longer he considered it. He rose, leaving the conference room, moving through the halls with a determined pace, ignoring the questioning looks from the few who passed him as he made his way to his office. He picked up his phone, scrolling to the number he had saved the night before, hesitating for only a moment before pressing call. Naomi answered on the second ring, her voice cautious, surprised to hear from him again so soon. William explained the situation, the flaw discovered, the urgency of the issue, the potential consequences. He spoke plainly, without the polished veneer of corporate speak, telling her what was at stake, what was needed. There was a pause, a moment of silence where he wondered if he had asked too much, if it was unfair to pull her into this, but when she spoke, her voice was calm, steady, asking him to send her the details, the logs, the code segments where the errors were surfacing. He did as she asked, sending the files, the data, everything they had gathered, watching the progress bar move across the screen, feeling the shift in himself as he trusted her with this, as he chose to believe in the knowledge and capability he had seen in her eyes. The hours that followed were a blur of movement and waiting, engineers running tests, phone calls with suppliers and partners held with careful words that reassured without revealing the depth of the challenge. William remained on the floor, moving between workstations, answering questions, offering what support he could, his phone close at hand, waiting for Naomi's response. It came late as the city outside was drenched in the orange glow of streetlights, as the offices above grew quiet, as the energy on the engineering floor remained taut but focused. Naomi's email arrived, a clear, concise explanation of the root of the problem, pointing to the memory allocation processes within the integration layer, highlighting the cascading failures triggered by specific patterns of use that had gone unnoticed in earlier testing. She offered a solution, a method to reallocate resources dynamically, to adjust the workflow within the code to prevent the freeze without requiring a complete overhaul. William read her message twice, 3 times, the clarity of it ringing with the same quiet authority he had heard in her voice as she taught children in a small room with peel and paint and outdated laptops. He called Patel, shared the details, the engineers gathering quickly, reading Naomi's notes, their eyes lighting up as they saw the path forward, as the problem that had seemed insurmountable only hours before began to unfold into something they could address, something they could fix. As they worked through the night, implementing the changes, running tests, confirming stability under stress conditions, the tension on the floor shifted, the urgency replaced with cautious optimism, the hum of the machines mixing with the quiet conversations of engineers who were beginning to believe that the launch could still happen, that the crisis could be averted. In the early hours of the morning, as the tests completed successfully, as the final checks confirmed the system's stability, as the relief settled over the floor like a quiet exhale, William stepped away, moving to a window overlooking the city as the first light of dawn broke across the skyline. He thought of Naomi, of her daughter, of the children who had learned to code on battered laptops, of the steady way Naomi had faced every challenge, every limitation, every dismissal, with the belief that there was always a way forward if one refused to give up. The crisis had passed, but the lesson remained, clear and undeniable, a reminder that solutions often came from unexpected places, from those who were overlooked, from those who worked in the quiet, in the shadows, building futures with the fragments others discarded. As the sun rose, casting the city in gold, William felt the exhaustion in his bones, but beneath it there was something else, something steady, something new. A quiet promise that this would not be the end of what they had begun, that the path forward would not ignore those who had proven they were ready to lead, if only someone was willing to trust them. The day following the crisis dawned cool and clear, the city washed in pale gold as William sat at his desk, the early sunlight casting soft shadows across the documents spread before him. The events of the past 2 days remained vivid in his mind. The tension that had gripped the engineering floor during the crisis, and the calm that had followed Naomi's quiet intervention, her clear, precise guidance cutting through the panic and confusion with a certainty that few in his company had been able to match. It was not only the solution she had provided that lingered with him, but the manner in which she had done so, the lack of hesitation, the straightforward clarity, the quiet confidence that came from hard-won knowledge rather than arrogance. It had changed something in him, quietly but undeniably, shifting his perspective in a way that left him unable to return to the comfortable assumptions he had once held about the boundaries between those who led and those who served. He found himself remembering the moment when the final test had passed, when the engineers had leaned back in their chairs, exhaustion and relief mixing on their faces, the soft murmur of conversation carrying across the floor as they began to believe in the success of the launch once more. William had stood back, watching them, the glow of the monitors illuminating the room, thinking of Naomi and the children she taught, of the old laptop she restored, of the small, determined hands learning to code under her guidance in a room that should never have needed to exist in the shadows of a city that claimed to value opportunity. He had promised himself in that moment that he would not let this be the end of what she had begun, that the work of creating access and opportunity would not be left to the quiet efforts of one woman alone. The following morning, William called a meeting with his executive team, the department heads filing into the glass-walled conference room, the air filled with the rustle of papers and the soft clatter of laptops being set on the table. They were prepared to discuss the final stages of the product launch, the marketing strategies, the distribution logistics, the carefully planned rollout designed to maximize the company's visibility and investor confidence. William let them begin, listening as they moved through their reports, noting the pride in their voices, the confidence that had returned now that the crisis had been averted. He let them finish before he stood, the silence falling across the room as they turned to him, waiting for the approval they expected. Instead, William spoke of Naomi Carter. He spoke of the crisis, of the flaw that had threatened the launch, of the solution that had come not from within their own ranks, but from a woman whose knowledge and insight had been overlooked because of the role she held within the company, a role that had nothing to do with her capabilities, but everything to do with the assumptions they had made about her. He spoke of the children she taught, of the devices she salvaged and repaired, of the nights she spent ensuring that those who had been forgotten by the system were given a chance to learn, to build, to believe in a future that included them. As he spoke, he saw the surprise in their faces, the discomfort, the shifting expressions as they realized the implications of what he was saying, as they began to understand that the boundaries they had drawn between themselves and others were neither as clear nor as justifiable as they had once believed. William told them of his decision to change that, to begin the process of dismantling those invisible walls, to create a partnership between Nexus and the Westside Family and Education Center, to provide resources, equipment, and support for the programs Naomi was running, to create a pathway for the children she taught to enter into internships and mentorships within the company, to build a bridge between the technology they developed and the communities that needed it most. There was resistance, as he had expected, questions about cost, about return on investment, about the potential for distraction from the company's core mission. William answered each concern calmly, pointing out that the mission of Nexus had always been to create technology that advanced education, that enabled opportunity, that opened doors, and that if they failed to embody those principles in their actions, then their mission was nothing more than a marketing slogan. He reminded them of the crisis, of how close they had come to failure, of how it had been Naomi's insight that had saved them, and how many others like her might exist within their walls, unseen and unheard, because they had chosen not to look, not to listen. He told them that change was not a distraction, but a necessity, that the strength of their company would be measured not only by its profitability, but by its integrity, by its willingness to align its actions with its stated values, by its commitment to the communities it claimed to serve. By the time the meeting ended, the room was quiet, the resistance softened, the questions replaced by the beginnings of acceptance, of understanding. William left them with the task of developing a proposal for the partnership, of identifying the resources they could provide, of creating a plan that would turn this vision into reality. And as they filed out of the room, he saw in their faces the reflection of the change that had begun to take root within himself. Later that day, William visited the center, arriving as Naomi was finishing a session with a group of teenagers who were working on a simple coding project. Their laughter and quiet concentration filling the room with an energy that felt more real, more genuine than anything he had felt in the polished halls of Nexus in a long time. Naomi looked up as he entered, her eyes meeting his with cautious curiosity, her posture straight, her hands resting lightly on the table in front of her. He explained what he had done, the meeting with the executives, the proposal for partnership, the commitment to providing resources and support, the plan to create a pathway for internships and mentorships, to open the doors of Nexus to the children she taught, to ensure that the opportunities they created were not limited to those who could afford them. Naomi listened in silence, her expression unreadable, her eyes steady on his as he spoke. When he finished, she remained quiet for a moment, the sounds of the children packing up their laptops, of parents arriving to collect them, filling the space around them. Then she spoke, her voice calm, her words careful, telling him that she would accept the partnership, but only if it was done in a way that respected the dignity of the children and families she served, that ensured the center remained a place of learning and growth, not a charity case or a marketing opportunity. She told him that the children needed to be seen for their potential, not their poverty, that they needed to be treated with the same respect and expectation that he would give to any of his employees or partners. William agreed, assuring her that this was not a gesture but a commitment, a step toward aligning the actions of Nexus with the values they claimed to hold, a recognition of the responsibility they bore as creators of technology that shaped the future. Naomi nodded, the faintest hint of a smile touching her lips, a warmth in her eyes that had not been there before, a trust that was cautious but real. In the weeks that followed, the partnership took shape, the center receiving new laptops, updated software, funding for repairs to the building, and the establishment of a formal internship program that allowed the teenagers Naomi taught to spend time at Nexus, learning from the engineers, participating in projects, seeing firsthand the possibilities that existed for them in the world of technology. Employees from Nexus began to volunteer at the center, offering their expertise, mentoring the children, learning from them in return, the boundaries between the company and the community beginning to blur in the best possible way. William found himself spending more time at the center, meeting with Naomi to discuss the progress of the programs, sitting in on sessions to watch the children learn, to see the spark of curiosity in their eyes, the pride in their accomplishments. He saw the way Naomi guided them, her patience, her quiet encouragement, her refusal to accept less than their best, her belief in their ability to rise to the challenges placed before them. He saw the way the children responded to her, the trust they placed in her, the respect they showed, the way they looked at her as a leader, as a mentor, as someone who believed in them even when the world around them did not. In those moments, William understood that the success of Nexus, the success of the launch, the success of the products they developed, all of it meant nothing if it did not translate into real, tangible change, if it did not create opportunities for those who needed them most, if it did not serve as a tool for building a better future. He saw the potential for what Nexus could become, not just a company that created technology, but a company that embodied the principles of equity and opportunity, that lived its mission in the choices it made, in the partnerships it formed, in the lives it touched. As the launch date arrived, the tension that had once filled the offices of Nexus was replaced with a quiet confidence, the knowledge that they had overcome the challenges before them, that they were prepared, that they were ready. The product launched successfully, the reviews positive, the investors pleased, the metrics exceeding expectations. But for William, the true measure of success came not from the numbers on the reports, but from the moments he witnessed at the center, from the smiles on the children's faces as they explored the new technology, from the quiet pride in Naomi's eyes as she watched them learn, from the knowledge that they had taken a step toward aligning their actions with their values. In the quiet moments after the launch, as the celebrations wound down, as the congratulatory messages faded, William found himself at the center once more, watching as Naomi led a session with a group of teenagers, guiding them through a project with the same calm confidence she had shown during the crisis. He saw the way she moved among them, answering questions, offering encouragement, challenging them to think critically, to solve problems, to believe in their own potential. And in that moment, William realized that this was only the beginning, that the true work lay ahead in the continued effort to build bridges, to create opportunities, to ensure that the future they were shaping with their technology was one that included everyone, not just those who could afford it. He saw the path forward, clear and undeniable, and he knew that it was a path worth following, a path worth dedicating himself to, a path that would define not only the future of Nexus, but his own future as well. The days following the successful launch settled over Nexus like a slow, satisfied exhale. The relief that had first swept across the engineering floors turned into a quiet pride, reflected in the way employees walked through the halls, in the nods exchanged in the elevators, in the small, unspoken glances between team members who had fought through sleepless nights to ensure the product would meet its promise. For William, the numbers that poured in, sales figures climbing steadily, positive reviews highlighted by the communications team, glowing emails from investors brought a satisfaction that once would have been complete in itself. But now they were only part of the picture. He found himself measuring the success of the launch not just by the metrics that appeared on his dashboard each morning, but by the quiet victories he saw at the Westside Family and Education Center. Each evening he arrived there, he found Naomi leading a small circle of teenagers through coding challenges, their laptops open, their brows furrowed in concentration, their faces lighting up with sudden understanding when a line of code finally ran without error. Younger children sat at smaller tables learning to navigate educational games on tablets, their laughter rising and falling in the background, the air filled with the low hum of learning, of curiosity being fed, of minds expanding in real time. There was something grounding in those evenings, something that brought clarity after long days of meetings and strategy sessions. William found himself seeking out those hours, not as an obligation but as a reminder of what the work at Nexus was meant to serve, of why technology mattered, of the lives it could touch when it was used with intention and care. Naomi had become a partner in the truest sense of the word, their conversations shifting from logistics of the donation programs and internship structures to discussions about curriculum development, about identifying the students with the strongest aptitude for technology, about how to challenge them further while supporting those who needed more time. Sometimes, after the children had left and the lights in the center were dimmed, they would stand near the windows, watching the neighborhood settle into its night rhythms. Cars rolled slowly down cracked streets, porch lights flickered on, the sound of distant music carrying faintly from an open window. Naomi would speak of her dreams for the center, of expanding to offer adult coding classes in the evenings for parents who wanted to understand the technology their children were using, of building a lending library of devices so that students could continue their learning at home without interruption. William would listen, asking questions, offering thoughts, finding in these conversations a sense of purpose that filled the spaces success alone could not. The partnership between Nexus and the center began to draw attention beyond the immediate community. A local news outlet ran a story about the collaboration, highlighting the way Nexus was providing equipment and volunteers to support technological education in underserved neighborhoods, how students who had never touched a new device were now building websites, learning the basics of app development, preparing to enter an internship pipeline that would guide them into potential future careers in technology. The piece was well received, sparking inquiries from other community centers, and soon William found himself sitting in meetings with city officials and nonprofit leaders discussing the potential of expanding the initiative to other neighborhoods, of building a network of centers that could replicate the success of Westside. Each conversation reaffirmed what he had seen in Naomi's work, what he had witnessed in the determined faces of the children, in the cautious gratitude of parents who began to believe that doors once closed might open for their sons and daughters. Nexus employees who had initially volunteered once out of curiosity began to return regularly, her insights as she helped guide the company's community initiatives. Their professional relationship grew, but so too did a quiet, personal understanding, an unspoken connection formed through shared purpose and long conversations about what it meant to build something lasting, something real. There were moments when William found himself lingering after meetings at the center, helping to stack chairs, to carry boxes of devices, to discuss future plans as Naomi's daughter played quietly nearby. The rhythm of those evenings felt different from the pace of the corporate world, slower, more deliberate, grounded in the tangible reality of the work they were doing together. On a crisp autumn evening, as leaves blew along the sidewalks outside the center, William and Naomi stood watching as a group of children worked on a robotics project, the small machines moving hesitantly across a table as the children adjusted code and repositioned sensors. Naomi's daughter sat nearby, laughing as one of the robots spun in a circle before toppling over, and Naomi's laughter joined her daughter's, the sound warm and genuine, a reminder of the simple joys that could be found even in the midst of hard work. William turned to look at Naomi, seeing the tired lines at the edges of her eyes, but also the light that had never dimmed, the quiet strength that had inspired him to see beyond the limits of his own assumptions. She looked at him, their eyes meeting with a shared understanding that no words were needed to express, an acknowledgement of the journey they had taken from suspicion and misunderstanding to partnership and purpose. In that moment, as the children cheered for a robot that completed its task without falling, as Naomi's laughter echoed softly, as the lights of the city began to twinkle outside the windows, William realized that success was not a destination, but a series of choices made every day, choices that determined whether the work they did would leave the world better than they found it. And as he stood there beside Naomi, watching the next generation learn, build, and believe, he knew they were on the right path, a path that would continue long after product launches were forgotten, a path that would define the true legacy of their work together. If you found this story meaningful, make sure to subscribe for more. Check out the other videos on the channel for stories that will stay with you. And if this one spoke to you, share it with someone who needs it too.